Hello, ladies and gents. So today is going to be a video on the first part of a series that we're making for universal materials, what we're going to call universal materials, which are basically any subject or any topic or anything that I think would be useful for any student in English class. And of course, the first one has to be about literary elements or writing strategies, whatever you want to call them, because these are the essentially the words and the vocabulary that any student of English literature should be familiar with. Now, let's see if I can get this out of the way. The term writing strategies is usually used on New York State Regents exams and AP exams and all that kind of stuff. You can use the word literary elements, you can use the word literary devices. There is a slight difference. We'll talk about that later. But this is basically a list of the terms and the ideas and the little techniques that we're going to use that you should memorize for any English class. English is a strange subject for many different reasons. And one of those reasons is that it is a skills-based class. It is not something that you could memorize a lot in, depending on who your English teacher is and how the course is being run. You can't really just memorize a bunch of equations and then kind of go from there. You have to have a skill. However, there is a small group of things, small pieces of English that you could memorize and that you kind of do just to kind of get the vocabulary of what we're talking about and what we're analyzing down and clear. And this is one of them. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through not every literary element because that would take, like a book to be able to do. We're going to have the most basic ones here described for you. We're going to talk about them a little bit. We're going to give you a couple little notes, maybe some examples. And then we're going to talk about devices in the same thing, in the same way. And then we're going to just call it a day. So it's a pretty simple, pretty straightforward one for us today. Now, like I said, if you want the actual kind of simple definition right here, it would be that literary elements and literary devices are basically a common feature to nearly every piece of fictional writing. The examples, of course, would be conflict, characterization, plot, imagery, et cetera, et cetera. We're going to get a lot more. But the distinguishing factor between a literary element and a literary device, most teachers are not going to ask you for those. But if you really want to know the distinction, an element is something that is common to every piece of literature. So if you hand me a book, hand me a story, it's going to have probably all of them in it. Every one of the elements that we're going to talk about is going to be in that particular piece of art. However, a device is a little bit more stylized, is a little bit more, specific to however the author is trying to make his or her point, or whatever point they're trying to make. So, without further ado, the first one, and probably one of the most essential literary elements that every good piece of artwork has, is conflict. Conflict here is defined as the struggle in the story that the character must overcome. Very basic, very simple, very essential. There's conflict, there's tension, there's something that needs to be done, there's something that needs to be dealt with. That exists in all stories. If you take the conflict out, you just have people sitting around and there's nothing driving the action forward. There's nothing driving the story forward. Now, most middle schoolers and then high schoolers will know all of these different distinctions between what types of conflict. Personally, as a teacher, I don't really see the need to make my students go through and say, oh, is this person versus person? Is this person versus this? I don't really care about the types of conflict. I just care generally about, hey, where is the conflict? Where do we see it? The only note that I would have my students make here is simply this: where specifically is the conflict taking place? Is it taking place externally or is it taking place internally within a character? If it's external, we can kind of see that all around here on these examples right here. We have the external conflict of MLK versus the laws and the kind of racism of his time. We see, if you recognize the movie Leonidas here with the wolf, so there's an external conflict there, literally with an animal, with a beast he has to fight. We see Luke Skywalker with his external conflict with Darth Vader. And then we, of course, see Frodo Baggins up here with his conflict, this external conflict to drop the ring into Mount Doom. However, the other category of conflict that I would talk about usually in class is the internal conflict. So you can have multiple conflicts at the same time. That's usually what makes a story more or a piece of artwork more deep and more kind of profound, is if there are multiple conflicts happening at the same time. So if you use the example over here on the left, MLK is having an external conflict with the racists of his time, or with the kind of policies and the culture of his time. However, while there's that external conflict, there could also be an internal conflict. There could be his own personal frustration, his own personal sadness, his own deep desire to overcome these things, and his kind of restraint that he needs to have in that situation. And the same thing could be for all the other scenes that we just talked about there. There's an internal conflict that's happening with the character as well. Now, if you want to get one level deeper, another kind of important note in the discussion about conflict is that the external conflict could be in some way, shape, or form a symbol or a representation of the conflict that we're actually we know about inside the character. The easiest example for me to point out is this one right here with Darth Vader and Luke Skywalker. Luke Skywalker is having a literal physical external conflict with this figure called Darth Vader. There's an internal conflict going on, though, with Luke Skywalker, either in that scene or later on in the story, where he is struggling to resist the temptation to evil, to the dark side of the Force, or to the seduction of his father, his evil father, and his father's masters. And that is symbolized in the external conflict that we see here. So sometimes an author can do something very clever like that, but we can talk about that more when we get into symbolism. Now, the next most common element that we're going to see in literature or in art in general is imagery. Imagery, if you want to use the longer definition, it's right there. The simplest definition is that it is just descriptive language, at least when we're talking about literature. It's just language that is describing something. Now, you'll notice what I didn't say there. I didn't say it describes how something looks. It could be how something sounds. It could be how something, strikes your ear. It could be how something feels to the touch, how something smells. So it's any sensory description that the author would give to something. So that's all you really have to say about imagery. Now, imagery, as you're going to see, when combined with other literary elements, or not, I wouldn't say combined, but imagery sort of gives rise to a lot of other literary elements and devices, is probably the more accurate way to put it. So for example, when we're specifically talking about literature and the written word, imagery will be used in other devices such as metaphors, similes, and symbols as well. So it's a very, very baseline kind of bedrock, sort of a root sort of imagery. Element that's going to give rise to the rest of the things that we're going to talk about later here. So keep imagery definitely in the back of your mind, because it is, in some sense, for a lot of different reasons that we will definitely talk about in other videos, really, really is an important one that we need to get clear. And has a profound impact on us as human beings. Now, characterization is probably the next of the big three. I'm putting the big three first. What I tell my students are the big three elements: conflict, characterization, and imagery, because they're everywhere. They're constantly everywhere, and they are, in my professional opinion, the elements that really are the seeds of everything else that happens within a story. Now, characterization, as it describes here, is the method an author uses to develop his or her characters. You could say that it is essentially how we learn the personality behind a character, how we see a character behaving. In terms of notes here, there's only two major distinctions between characterization. Within characterization, it's if you have direct characterization, when an author directly tells you, this character is kind, this character is cruel, this character is great, this character is powerful, whatever. Whereas probably much more often, we're going to have indirect characterization, invoking that usual show, don't tell sort of rule in art, which is we're going to show you the character's personality. And usually in class, I show this particular slide and I have my students simply look at these four scenes or these four figures and explain to me what is the personality that we are seeing here? So whether you're looking at Darth Vader, Jesus Christ, this mother figure who could be the Virgin Mary, or Achilles and Hector down here, we get different personality traits based on all of them. Now, how is it that we get that? How is it that we know, for example, that this woman here is loving? I usually play a joke with my students. I say, okay, what do you got here? What's going on? And they say, oh, well, the person is characterized as loving. And I simply ask, how? How do you know that? They say, oh, well, because she's holding a baby. I'm like, well, how do you know she's not kidnapping the baby? And I just go down and down and down and down, this kind of like Sherlock Holmes sort of way of thinking and teaching. And it slowly dawns on my students that the way that we know that this is a particularly good figure, let me get my face out of the sun here for you, is because of all the different factors playing into our analysis of this particular image. We see the way the woman is holding the child, we see her face when she's holding the child, we see the baby's face, we see all these different little pieces of imagery that are coming together and showing us that we have a character here who is nurturing, who is kind, who is not cruel, who means no immediate harm to that child. So that person is characterized as all of those things. Okay. Now we can go down the list, like I said, for all these other images and do the exact same thing, but that's always been my personal favorite to do. And we get the kind of gist of characterization just from that. Now, another really quickly, we're going to go a little bit faster now because those big three are kind of out of the way. Setting is the most common one that comes next, is where is a place or where is a particular story or a piece of artwork set. Now, it's not just the literal physical place. It could also be the time. It could be the culture. It could be the general environment. There's a lot of different things that could play into that. And as I kind of hinted down here in the notes, this will usually contribute to the mood of a particular story or scene quite a bit. We usually have in good works of artwork, the setting reflecting something about the story to the audience, whether it is how we should feel, how it reflects the nature of the characters in that particular scene, or the conflicts within that particular story. You know, the obvious one that I always point out down here is, of course, in the corner here, is Mordor, right? So we have a good artistic depiction of Mordor from Lord of the Rings. The name Mordor, right? Just the language itself kind of gives you a hint as to the setting. The setting is not just, oh, it's some dark place with a volcano and this giant, you know, evil tower. It's a lot more than that. It's a whole symbol. It's a whole effective kind of tool to show you the mood of that particular place and to convey a lot of the ideas within the story through just the setting alone. Okay. Same thing can be said for all these other places, which are mostly European landscapes. Now, speaking of mood, mood is, in my personal opinion, what I try to teach my students, is one of the more complex literary elements. And the reason it's complex is because it is affected by, and it is almost created by all the other elements combined together. And then it is also difficult to articulate and to describe because it is intuitively understood. It's also something that's very easy to understand because of that. So, for example, in class, what I usually do is I show, you know, some scenes like the ones we have here to my class, and I say, you know, how did these make you feel? And that's an annoying process, but that's a typical process of an English class or a class on literacy, because we have the experience, right? We have this initial experience. Everyone who's not just totally tuned out mentally will be able to feel something. It's like listening to music. You feel something if you are actually awake and your eyes and ears are open. However, the complex part is then describing or articulating what it is that we feel. It's like, I have this feeling, I'm trying to actually put it down on paper or articulate it in words. What is it that I'm feeling? So, for example, with the scene right here from the Chronicles of Narnia film, what is it that we're feeling? What's the mood of this particular scene? Some people will say, oh, it's joy, or it's kind of happiness in general. It's this jubilee kind of spirit of a mood. It's making me feel happy. And then we just need to kind of dig into it a little bit more and maybe find a better word or find a more accurate word. And what I like to do with my students in particular is break down how is it that that particular scene evoked that particular mood. And that's what I mean when I say that this particular little element, mood, is a combination of all the other elements kind of working together. So, for example, How do we get the mood of happiness or of joy from this particular scene? Well, it could be the imagery. It's the imagery of the colors, of the facial expressions of that person. Speaking of the person, there's characterization happening there as well. It could be the setting. So there's an actual kind of positive Christmas-like setting there, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You could say maybe there's conflict or there's no conflict there, essentially, helping us kind of understand or helping us kind of feel that mood. So mood, deeply effective, deeply important literary elements for art, but also kind of complex to understand and articulate at times. This is a weird one and kind of an annoying one. The term central idea is something that is a sort of residue on my own teaching style and my own materials from my days as a Regents teacher in New York State. The Regents exam in New York State really emphasizes this term, and I'm not as familiar with the other terms that we see around the country, on having students understand a central idea and write about a central idea. Now, as you see here, it's articulated as just a focused topic or idea that the author is focusing on. So that usually, as I tell my students, again, kind of focusing on the simplicity of the New York State Regents requirements, is just one word, one simplistic idea or term that an author is generally kind of touching on. It could be something as basic as the words I listed here: love, hate, fear, mystery, anger, strife, whatever you want to call it, essentially, whatever the particular scene that we're looking at is. There can be more than one in any piece of literature, and any passage from literature. So, for example, if you slap me a passage from, Sherlock Holmes, I could read it, and it may be like a page long. It could be a paragraph long, and it could have maybe one clear central idea, one clear idea that's like, yeah, the author is, definitely focusing on this, but it could have other ones as well. Most texts do have multiple ideas that they are focusing on. And as you might have kind of understood here, the term or the central idea itself can easily be linked with the genre of the particular text that we're looking at. So of course, for something like Romeo and Juliet or whatever love story you want to pick, yes, love is focused on a lot in that particular story. And depending on the story, not necessarily Romeo and Juliet, the genre would be a love story. Or if you're watching a suspenseful kind of horror or thriller movie, the central idea would be fear, would be horror itself. And therefore, we have that clear link between the genre and the idea. I will move on in my classes and as in my career as I kind of move on as a teacher away from central idea. And I think that's generally a good thing, because central idea, as you're seeing, is a very simplistic kind of just good starting point for students. It's not meant to be something that is focused on, in my personal professional opinion, as long as the Regents exam does. The Regents exam focuses on central idea for almost 3 years of high school. I don't think we need to do that. I think students are much more capable and competent and can kind of learn it really quickly, see a couple examples, and move on to something more complex like theme. So what is a theme? Well, welcome to the English debate, because a lot of English teachers that I had when I grew up, and a lot of professors that I've had, would have simply said that a theme is synonymous or would look very similar to a central idea. If you want to be a little more sophisticated about it, if we want to make a clear distinction, the theme is, as I articulated here, the author's underlying idea or teachings in some sense about their central idea. So, for example, if we have a story that has the central idea of evil, right? There's something talking about evil. Evil is very present. The author is really kind of focusing on this idea. Well, then what would their theme be? Their theme might be, as I articulated here in the example, what is the nature of evil? What is evil actually like? So, for example, we're watching Star Wars, we're enjoying it. We're seeing Darth Vader, we're seeing the Emperor, we're seeing all these Sith and Jedi fight. And it's like, okay, well, evil is very clearly a central idea in Star Wars. But I think something that George Lucas was doing was showing this theme of what is the nature of evil. The nature of evil is blah, 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 blah. Like we could actually discuss that for quite a while. That's what a theme is, right? So that is like a theme of Star Wars. And the example I gave up here for all my Harry Potter nerds, as we can see, is a little clip from the Tale of the Three Brothers. Death is a central idea in Harry Potter. You might argue that it's one of the main central ideas of Harry Potter. Well, okay, fine. Death, is a recurring idea that comes up again and again in Harry Potter. Sure. But what is the theme about death? Maybe, for example, and I actually gave the passage right there from Harry Potter, is that death is actually not to be feared. It is something that is the next big adventure for us as human beings. That's the theme. Okay, so you see that clear distinction between, okay, just a simple idea or concept that the author wants to kind of convey to us versus something that is a little bit more complex that the author is showing us. Now, something even more basic, plot. Okay, I don't spend a lot of time on plot because it's not usually discussed that much. We could learn the whole, plot map and how things, are how you have the distinguishing sections of a particular plot. Personally, as a teacher, I'm not that interested in those sort of things. We're going to talk about those in a couple of videos from now about how a journey versus a tragedy plot, is different. But there's a basic plot structure, plot map, if you want to go through that. We have the introduction, the main problem, or the kind of introduction of a problem, the climax, the highest point of tension, the resolution, and the conclusion of the story. It's a basic kind of way to map the plot. But you simply want to write down in your notes that a plot is just the order of events in the story. That works out totally fine. Point of view, another universal literary element. What point of view, what perspective is the narration being given to us through and by? There are three options here. Each of those three has a variety of different forms they could take, or a variety of different styles that they could take. So, for example, a first-person point of view. How do we identify this? This is when the narrator, the person telling you the story, is actually a character within the story. So if the story begins with something like, I got up and I walked to school, that is a first-person point of view. We are getting the actual story as if we are in the story, as if we are in that character's shoes, and that person is telling it to us. Now, you'll notice as a side note, as a kind of a deeper note here, that opens up a lot of problems, or a lot of not necessarily problems, but a lot of very interesting things for us as readers and people who are trying to analyze the story. For example, is the narrator reliable if it's a first-person narration? We usually will get a very, not a very, but a relatively reliable first-person narration. The further back you go in the history of literature, you're going to recognize that, okay, like the authors are not very interested in making the point of view that complicated to see. And that kind of complicated to kind of sift through. It's like, is this person lying to us? Is this narrator telling us a completely false story? That's very rare. We get a little bit more of it the more modern we get within literature. So, for example, the cliche example is Edgar Allan Poe's *The Telltale Heart*, where we actually get the story of a murder told through the perspective of the murderer, except that particular person is going insane. So the person's crazy, the person's just absolutely whacked, and we're getting to see kind of what that scene looks like through that person's eyes. A very unreliable narrator. A second person narration is very, very strange, and it's very, very rare depending on what books you're reading and what sections of Barnes and Noble you're trying to, look in. It's basically, you're not going to really usually see that in high school, but if you grab a book and it's one of these books that's almost like an RPG, that's kind of letting you go through a particular story, and you choose where you want to go. So you, the reader, are actually the character in the story. And it will say, as it says here, you got up and got out of bed and you walked to school. All right. So strange, but it is a thing. It is a possibility. The most common point of view that we get, however, is what we would call third person, where we have a narrator that we're not totally sure who it is. It's not necessarily the author, and it is not a character in the actual story. It's just a narrator telling us the story. So instead of I got up and I got out of bed and I walked to school. You got up, you got out of bed and you walked to school. You would say, James got up, got out of bed, and walked to school. Then James did this, then James did that. So it's a narrator that's sort of above the action, telling us, the readers, what's going on. That's the most common form of narration that we're usually going to see in literature. Now, there's multiple kinds of third-person narrations. There's, for example, a third-person narrator who is omniscient, who knows all of the things going on inside of the character's mind. There are third-person narrators that are not omniscient, that just tell you what a character's doing and give you maybe some glimpses into what they're thinking. This is typically more common, but we don't really need to know that. That's a little bit too deep for this stage in what we're trying to learn. Okay. Now, diction, really simple literary element. That is just word choice. What is the particular word that the author is using? It's a good thing to know, not only for analyzing literature, but it's also really good to know for your writing skills, which we're going to get into later. Diction is something I always tell my students you want to focus on, particularly when you're trying to improve your writing. You want to what's called elevate your diction, or be precise in your diction. You want to choose words that have the proper meaning, that link themselves perfectly with what you're trying to say. We are blessed and cursed as English teachers, as English students, as English speakers, because the English language is actually the most complicated, I wouldn't say the most complicated, sorry, it is the largest language. It has the largest vocabulary of all the languages in the world right now. Why is that? It's because it's a combination of 3 different language traditions. And because of this, we have a lot of synonyms, a lot of options with our vocabulary to choose the words that we want to use as accurately as we could. Now, that's complicated because that again presents a problem for us, because if we're trying to analyze a piece of literature, we have a lot more to analyze, therefore. Why did the author choose that particular word, this particular phrase in this particular space? That's kind of the detail that we end up getting into. For your own writing, it's a little bit more complicated, because I'm going to ask that my students be a little bit more what's called sophisticated in their diction. Don't use repetitively the same word over and over again. Don't use diction that is, ridiculously high and complicated while you're also trying to say something really simple. Don't use really, really simplistic kind of too kiddish and too immature diction when you're trying to sound more sophisticated, okay? So that's diction. Now, a little bit more complicated, especially when it comes to our discussions about speeches and about analyzing characters, analyzing a person's writing. Tone. So we usually, as kids, as younger people, will remember tone used from our parents. When our parents say, "Hey, don't use that tone with me," or "Hey, fix your tone," or something like that. What the heck are they talking about? It's simply a discussion of how, I don't really like this definition personally, where it says, "Oh, it's the author's attitude about what they're writing about." Yeah, that's one way to put it. An easier way to put it is it's simply the emotion that is behind a person's words, either in writing or in actual speech. How do they feel? What is it that they are trying to communicate? What element, or what not elements, what emotions are they communicating through their particular words? How do we distinguish this? How do we understand this? What words do we use to describe this? Well, the examples in the notes are pretty helpful, because if you're using a sarcastic tone, which is common enough among discussions with friends and family, what does that mean? That means it's a tone that's not serious. It's not entirely it's not meant to be taken entirely literally. So that right there is one of my favorite examples of tone. If I'm saying, "Oh yeah, you're such a genius," it's like, okay, that tone is very obviously sarcastic. That tone is very obviously not sincere. You're trying to make a point, whatever. Whereas if I'm saying, "Hey, you are a really, really great person," that is not as sarcastic or insincere. Now, how do you distinguish between those things? It's all in the tone. It's all in the way that the words are spoken. It's all in the way that the voice sounds when you are communicating that. And that's a complicated thing. I mean, that's something that's very similar to music and mood, where we just need to learn to intuitively read those things, intuitively understand those things, learn the rhythm of someone's voice and what it means. Now, as a side note, something that's kind of fun with this, as to kind of see the developments of human communication, is in the past 20 years or so, we've developed technology of texting. And texting was initially meant to be very short kind of blips of information back and forth. It wasn't meant to have, the classic like paragraphs that your friends can send you or your girlfriends can send you, giving you this long dissertation about whatever it is they want to talk about. Now, typical, whatever Key and Peele skit you're watching or whatever Comedy Central skit you're watching, that can happen is that when you're reading a text, you might totally misunderstand the tone. So if, for example, if you text someone and you say, hey, do you want to hang out today? And the person says, no, period. What's the tone? Is that like, no, sorry, like, no, sorry, I kind of feel a little bit tired, I want to relax. Or is it, no, leave me the heck alone? I don't want to hang out with you. So there was one word, but that tone, could be all the difference in the world. Now you'll see what I did right there. How is it that you can create the tone that you want? Well, you just add more words. You add a bigger, more context within the message. However, we have created, as always happens with language and writing and communication, a swifter way of communicating our tone, which is the lovely creation of emojis. It's why if someone in my life, you know that I always give emojis, because it's one of the easiest ways for me to show my tone. It's like a happy tone, happy smiley face, kind of sad tone, a little more serious tone. The emojis kind of shortcut that for us. So that's tone. You'll hear more about this, particularly if you're in my classes. You'll hear more about this in 10th grade in our 10th grade videos. We actually analyze the speeches of these boys down below. Okay, now, structure. Another really kind of simplistic literary element that we're going to see, particularly in poetry, a little bit less so in prose and in structured writing of books and novels. The structure is simply, how does the author organize their writing, essentially? What is the sentence length that they're working with? How many stanzas are in their poem, if we're talking about a stanza? How have they chosen their structure, and why did they choose their structure? What effect does that structure have? So, for example, the cliche example, of course, in poetry would be if we see a poem that is 14 lines long and follows a set structured rhyme scheme, it's like, oh, students will know that's a sonnet. Okay, well, why? What does that mean? Like, what does that actually inform us? How does that inform us about the work overall? Well, that particular structure has an effect on us, the readers, depending on how knowledgeable you are. You might say, oh, it's a sonnet, so it must be a love poem, or it might be a very deep and emotional poem. Whereas if you're reading prose, you're reading just the basic sentence structure, and you see, for example, that an author is using really, really long sentences, and then they slowly, maybe as the action and the scene starts to change, their sentences become a lot shorter. Well, why? What is that doing? What is that choice of structure doing? It's kind of increasing the pace. It's changing the mood. It's changing the tone. So structure affects the other elements just as much as the other ones affect it. So good one to know. Not going to be focused on all that much, but just good to have in your back pocket. Okay, so those were the basic literary elements that we will talk about throughout English, throughout class, and throughout the next few videos. However, devices are a little bit different. They are not, as I said before, universal. They are not in every single piece of artwork that you're going to look at. They're specific. They are stylistic. They enhance a piece of literature or a piece of artwork to the specific desires of that particular author. So let's go through. We'll see a few. There's a lot of these, but we're not going to go through every single one. We're going to go through the most common ones. Everybody's favorite, everyone's easiest to remember, is a simile. It is simply a comparison or a link between two things using the word like or as. So, for example, if you say to someone, your eyes are like the stars, this is a simile. You are comparing her eyes, his eyes, to the stars and saying you have these big, beautiful eyes, all this kind of stuff. Or if you say to someone, our love is like a rose, Now, I recognize that that's a simile. The complex part, of course, which we're going to get into later, is what the heck does that mean? What do you mean my love is like a rose? You mean my love is a flower that pricks you when I touch it? All that kind of stuff. That's not really nice. Or that my love or our love is like this beautiful thing that looks amazing, and when it blooms, it has this beautiful effect on the world. So that's the whole analysis of a simile. But that's, in short, what a simile is. Now, more complicated is a metaphor, which is essentially a simile without the words like or as. So if we go back for a minute, the metaphors here, if you want to turn them into metaphors, would simply be her eyes are stars, or her eyes were stars, or my love was a rose. You'll notice that sounds way more, the word we're going to use here, of course, is metaphorical. The word we could also use is figurative, not literal. We're not literally saying that my eyes are these burning balls of gas, that are going to, enlighten the entire galaxy. That's not what we're saying here. It is a metaphor. It is a figurative phrase. It is a figure of speech. Okay. However, it is informing us about something that the author, that the particular person is trying to convey. What are they trying to convey? It's going to depend on the metaphor. So that's a good introduction also to the term figurative language, all right, or a figure of speech. It's something that is not meant to be taken literally. And of course, as you kind of can tell, similes and metaphors are going to be much, much more common. Particularly metaphors are going to be very common when you're talking about, or when you're analyzing poetry, or an author that is trying to use very poetic terminology. So be aware of this. This is one of the reasons why people don't like poetry all that much, is because it tends to be very, very metaphorical and very difficult to kind of decode or understand. Personification is simply when we are giving person-like qualities, as minimal as they could be, to something that is non-personal. Okay. Now, the cliche example is, Aesop's fables, right? Where we personify an animal, right? We have an animal that's literally wearing a waistcoat, that has glasses, and is walking around and talking, all this kind of stuff. Yeah, that's technically personification, but it's a very kindergarten kind of way of thinking of personification. A more advanced and a much more common way that we're going to see personification is where we are describing something, particularly in nature, and describing something that's doing, or something about it, with a person-like feature. So, for example, the face of the sun. The sun does not have a face. There is no eyes and mouth and nose on the sun. So when you say, for example, the sun is smiling today, is it literally? No, of course not. It is just, what does that mean? That is a piece of figurative language. So what does that mean when someone says that the sun is smiling? It means that the sun's out, okay? Or if it says, for example, that the trees are waving at us today. As much as I say that to my niece and nephew when we're walking around, no, that's not particularly literal. That's not a literal piece of information there. The tree is not sentient and saying, "Hey, what's up?" It's not what it's not what we're saying. We're saying that it is blowing in the wind and it looks as though it is waving. So another good example of figurative language. Now, repetition, easiest probably thing on here to remember. It's when an author repeats a phrase. This can be very, very simplistic, and it can be very, very complicated at the same time. Repetition could be just the repetitive use of a particular word again and again and again and again through a poem, through a passage in a story, or throughout a book. Okay. It could be one phrase. It could be a word. It could be a whole sequence of phrases. It could be the repetition of a particular type of structure. So when we're looking for a pattern that kind of repeats again and again and again, that's repetition. What is the point of repetition? Why does an author put it into his or her writing or his or her piece of artwork? It's to make a point. It's to emphasize something, whether it's the theme, whether it's an emotion, whether it's a mood, whether it's their tone, all that kind of stuff. So it is a really, really complex and also a popular way to change up the style of your particular artwork. Irony. Irony is always my least favorite element to teach or to talk about, because it's one of those annoying ones where it's like, how do we describe this? How do we put this into words? Because we all kind of know what it is. We all know when we see it, Like all these pictures right here, when it says, for example, safety begins with you as the bus, crashes into a car. Nothing is written in stone. The person wrote in stone. All this kind of stuff. And I love the three things I hate: vandalism, irony, and lists. Perfect example. What is it then? What is irony? It's when something happens that is completely contrary to what we were expecting or what it means. Or like it says here, when something has a very different meaning to what the actual meaning is, it may be used in situations that are much more comical, that are meant to be comical. It could be used in particular words, so it's ironic that you're using that particular phrase. It could be more often than not, as you understand it, situational irony, like I'm driving to a wedding and I run into a swan on the way. My car gets splattered with swan feathers, and I drive up and I finally get to the wedding. And of course, what's the theme of the wedding? It's swans. Now, the more common example is going to be dramatic irony. So dramatic irony is when we, the audience of a story, know something about the events or about the characters on the screen or on the stage or in the book that the characters in the story do not know, do not understand. So, for example, there's somebody hiding under the table and there's a bunch of action going on the stage or in the particular scene of the play or whatever artistic form it is. We, the audience, know the person's there, but the other characters don't. That's an example of dramatic irony. So we could have phrases dropped again and again and again that we will understand, but the characters in the actual story do not understand. That is dramatic irony. Okay. Now, that can happen also in movies a lot. That can happen in shows when someone kind of hints something or someone references something, when the music kind of is tense or kind of swells and nobody has any other reactions on the screen. And it's like, why? It's because we, the audience, know something that they do not understand. Okay. Now, symbolism. We're going to have a whole video in this series about symbolism, but basically, just as a good introduction to this simple device, is what is symbolism? It is just an object, or it is when an object, a person, or a situation itself has not just one literal basic meaning. It has many deeper, more significant figurative meanings beneath it. It's like I said, I like the way this is phrased actually. The actions of a character, the action of a character, word, or an action itself, or the event have a deeper meaning in the context of the entire story. So the quick kind of preview to one of our other videos is right here. We look at a rose, a chalice, a candle, a sword. All of these things are basic objects, basic things we could see every day. But their colors, the context that they're placed in, the emphasis that we give them causes them to have much more profound meanings than we are initially aware of. And we might sense those symbols. We might kind of sense the meaning, but we have to learn, and we're going to learn in that video, how to articulate that and why it has those meanings. Okay, so be aware of this. Symbolism going to be probably one of the more common, probably depending on what class you're in with me, probably one of the most common devices that I talk about in teaching. Okay, allegory. Now, flip side of symbolism is allegory. If you don't like symbolism, if you think symbolism is too complicated, we got to track all these different meanings that the author is trying to convey, all the different possible interpretations of a symbol. Allegory is your friend in that sense. Now, why is that? It's because allegory is when one particular thing does not have multiple different meanings. There's only one simple correspondence that the author is making. The classic and the kind of cliche example is this book down here, Animal Farm. If you're reading Animal Farm by George Orwell, Animal Farm is an allegory because every particular person, every particular event in that story corresponds one-to-one with a basic event or a basic figure in history. So, for example, Napoleon the Pig is an allegory of Joseph Stalin, period. He is not an allegory of Adolf Hitler. He is not symbolic of just any old tyrant. No, he is an allegory of this particular figure known as Joseph Stalin. That's what George Orwell meant him to be, okay? Now, you can do more with that. You can say, well, George Orwell didn't intend for it just to be, to work as a symbol for all tyrants in some sense. No more than Joseph Stalin himself is a symbol for all tyrants. But that's essentially what an allegory is. When we just have the simple one-to-one correspondence, there's no deep, complex kind of way to interpret it. It's just one thing that the author means. Okay? Now, illusion, another really common device that I will reference quite a bit, depending on the class that we're in, but usually in ninth grade, quite a bit we reference illusions, and 11th grade as well. It is when, and if you want to just simply write down or understand it as this, it's simply a reference. It's a reference to some greater work of literature. Now, greater or older, have that fun debate, but it's simply that. Now, when we are studying Western English literature, there's generally going to be two groups of literature or two groups of stories that most of our literature will reference, will allude to. Those are Greek mythology and the Bible, because for some reason, we can talk about that in a humanities class, but the Greek myths and the biblical stories have influenced our artwork and our culture extremely deeply and very, very profoundly, maybe to the point where we don't even realize how deeply they have influenced us. So when we reference these things with our words, with our phrases, in our stories, those are allusions, is what we call those. So for example, if we say, oh, someone's going to get crucified if they say this, or that. It's like, yeah, it's a figure of speech. I don't mean you're literally going to get dragged onto a cross. It means that you're going to be like, completely shunned. You're going to get canceled. You're going to get all this kind of stuff. That's what crucifixion means. I was like, you're going to be crucified, but sure. But what is that an allusion to? Well, it's very clearly an allusion to the Roman practice of crucifixion, probably more specifically referencing the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth. Sure. If someone, for example, and I love these examples here, if someone says to you, you flew too close to the sun, what the heck are they talking about? Are you talking like I got in a plane and I just shot up into space and ran into the sun? No, that's not what that means at all. It is referencing the Greek myth of Icarus, who created wax wings and thought he was, all it in a bag of chips, and he flew up and thought he was amazing, and he was too close to the sun melted his wings, he falls and he dies. Classic myth that everyone in the ancient world knew. So when you say you flew too close to the sun, that's what that means. That's what that is alluding to. Okay. If you are studying William Shakespeare, get ready to have your illusion, radar go off the charts, because William Shakespeare loves to allude to a lot of different things, whether it's medieval literature, whether it's biblical literature, whether it's Greek literature. He just kind of drops allusions all over the place. It's one of the reasons why I tell my students, and we're going to talk about this in the humanities class, that knowing Greek myth and knowing biblical literature is really, really important to understanding English literature overall. Because if you don't understand those things, you're not really fully going to understand the references and the influences of of that particular author that particular author was drawing on for their work. Okay, a foil, a really kind of simple one. A foil is when we have a character who exists essentially as a contrast, or to show the contrasting uniqueness of another character, or maybe vice versa. The examples here excuse me, are really obvious. So Batman and the Joker. The Joker is a foil for Batman. What does that mean? You might look at that and say, oh, they're opposites. They're heroes and villains. Be careful, okay? A foil is not when one character is the villain to another character. That's not a foil. More often than not, that does happen because that's a fun way to kind of show a contrast or show a foil or a kind of conflict with thematically with two characters. So, for example, Batman and the Joker are thematically opposed. You have Batman, who's a symbol of order and justice. You have the Joker, who's a symbol of chaos and disorder and evil. So those characters are opposites. They also foil each other. That just happens to be, the nature of what foils are. However, the better example here is Martin Luther King and Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. So both of these guys were great civil rights leaders. Everyone likes to debate their methods and all that kind of stuff, but that's what's being foiled. Martin Luther King is a foil to Malcolm X. Malcolm X flirts with a little bit more of the idea of potentially violence and self-defense resistance, whereas MLK does not. MLK is very passive. He wants everyone to be peaceful and kind of even allow themselves to be put in jail and be punished. This is a foil. This is how Malcolm X is a foil to Martin Luther King because he adopts a very different way of behaving. You can see that also in this depiction of Lord of the Flies characters. We have a character, Jack, who's very, very aggressive and very, very chaotic, and he foils the much more calm and much more orderly character of Ralph. So when we have a character that are characters usually that are kind of opposites in some sense or are very, very different to each other, those are foils. Okay. Now, speaking of character types, an archetype, another term we're going to have an entire video on, but it's a good one to know for basic devices. An archetype is a pattern of character that we see repeated again and again and again, not just through literature, but through all of art, even religion, even psychology, even in real life, just again and again and again, we see a particular type of character, a type of figure repeating itself and kind of coming up again and again and again. I gave some basic examples here: the hero, a mentor, a trickster, a monster, a tyrant. We see all of these four figures here. You could probably kind of piece those together, right? We see a dragon, right? Like a monster, some beast that we have to kind of overcome. We see this old guy in a hat with a stick who has the ability to, have magic and kind of guide other characters. That's a mentor, et cetera, et cetera. Like I said, we'll have a whole other, section where we talk about this, but good thing to notice is when we're looking at these characters, particularly in bigger, more complex, more famous pieces of literature, we're going to say, oh, I've seen characters like that before. I've seen a kind of character enact a role like that before. Well, that's probably an archetype, okay? So we'll come back to those later. Now, that's it for basic literary elements and basic literary devices. So if you understand those terms, if you just make yourself familiar with those particular terms, if you just memorize those terms, you'll be in a much better space for the rest of your time in English literature or your time studying English literature. So try to get those down, and then we will move on to the next series or the next video in our series of universal materials. Thanks very much.